This is another podcast from Argan Solutions. And we've got the wonderful opportunity to speak with Tom Carnack from...
Tom Rivet Carnack.
Tom Rivet Carnack.
Yeah. I've come out of the closet with a double-barreled name.
Well, I should for all, you know, my kids are Rhys Durhams. We've merged our surnames.
Okay. There we go.
Me being Fraser Durham and Katie Rees. But we are here today. We're going to talk about... I was thinking today, Tom, we would talk about the COP.
Great.
Cop26. It's the next big meeting. It's in a few weeks' time, a couple of weeks' time. And Tom, I'd really just like to explore your journey from Paris to where we are at the moment, just to sort of try and, I think, try and explore, therefore, what you think might come out of this COP26 and try and sort of... hopefully anybody who's listening to this sort of try and help them understand what we're expecting.
Sure.
But what I want to start with is, so when I met Tom, he was on a bit of a journey. And one of the things that you'd done is you had spent your time as a Buddhist monk for
Indeed.
a couple of years. And I was just wondering, with your experiences, if you can just talk about that a little bit more, but what would you, as the kind of the Buddhist in you from those experiences, how would you take those and kind of apply them to what's happening in climate at the moment in terms of sort of trying to make things happen?
Sure. So I'm really happy to talk about that, and really, really nice to be here. And I should share with your listeners that, and I'm happy to tell you about my time in the monastery, but after I left the monastery and I was like 27 years old and I kind of came back into the world and had never really had a job before. And I met this very nice man called Anthony Turner who suggested that I come and work with him at Carbon Sense. And really my only colleague was this lovely bloke called Fraser Durham. And having not had a job until I was about 27 years old, what was really interesting about that experience was that the example that Fraser set of, like, in every interaction between colleagues having a default to generosity, in every interaction having a default to how can we work together to be creative, to find a solution to a problem, I actually credit with quite a considerable shaping experience in my life. And I draw a direct line between that and a lot of things I subsequently did. So I'm very grateful to you, Fraser. I just want to start off by saying that. And it's really nice to be here. So when I was growing up, I had always had this sense that there was sort of something wrong with my mind. I needed to do something about it, that I sort of wasn't really in control of how I was thinking about things. So I started doing meditation retreats. And when I finished my degree, I went to Southeast Asia and ended up ordaining as a monk and spending a bit more than 2 years there. And it's a sort of interesting and wonderful experience living like that. And it was a forest monastery, so I'd beg for food twice a day. And other than that, I was just basically on my own in my hut. And when you first do something like that, it's kind of a nightmare, right? Because we all have a flow of thoughts and impressions and emotions. And we're used to certain things happening in the world, interesting conversations, interesting sounds, whatever else. In the monastery, they call it orificity. It's all about one orifice or another. And so after a while, all of that stops. You don't have any of that interesting sensory engagement. And it's kind of terrible. But then after a while, all of that slows down and you can sort of look around and you can see how wonderful the world is. And you can also direct that attention towards yourself and how you work. And so the highly sensitized mental and emotional states kind of pass after you come back into the world. But the thing that I've left with that was sort of like the insight to a degree that I was able to generate from that is that there is a gap between what happens in the world and how we choose to respond to it. There's a little chink of light. And for most people going around, it doesn't appear that light exists. Something happens, someone yells at you, cuts you up when you're driving, something else happens, the kids scream, whatever. And it feels that the instinctive reaction that comes is inherent in the phenomena of the world. But what you realize when you slow down is that there's a gap and there's a choice. And there's a physical sensation, then you react to that physical sensation. And in a world that is increasingly fused with its reactions, that can, in some circumstances, become sort of a superpower that you have the chance to reflect before you act.
So that's a really, really interesting response. And I just want to take it one step forward in your career.
In the Argan Solutions Buddhist podcast.
The Energy and Buddhism podcast, right here, right now. So you went through Carbon Sense, where we worked together, but then you went to the Carbon Disclosure Project and then eventually ended up working with Christiana Figueres as part of the team working on the Paris, towards Paris, that particular one. And there was a particular story in there that I was really interested that you've mentioned before, which was about maybe slowing down and stopping and looking for that chink of light, which was something about a note that Christiana passed across to you whilst you were in the middle of negotiations.
Yes, yeah.
And I just wondered whether, I just think it's a really important point or a lovely story to kind of just hear in the context of political negotiations that for most people, and myself included, I have no clue. I have no clue how these things work. I just see the outcome. I don't understand it. And I just think it might be quite an interesting insight. So if you could share
Yeah, of course.
Share that.
No, really, really happy to talk about that. And that's, I discussed this a bit in my TED Talk as well as some other things. So I met Christiana in 2013. And she was looking for someone to come and run political strategy for her. That means 500 brilliant people at the UN Climate Convention, but they sort of, she didn't have anyone who sort of had that broad political lens on what the outcome might be. So we actually went for a walk in New York, at the end of which she turned to me and said, well, it's clear to me you have none of the experience necessary for this job, but I think it'd be great, let's do it, which was my first sort of experience of Christiana acting intuitively. So I went into this incredibly complex, knotty situation of the road towards what will become the Paris Agreement, 20 years of basically countries fighting about fairness, right? So for all those years, developing countries would say to developed countries, you caused this problem, and what's more, you said you'd sort it out, so go away and do something about it, and then we'll talk about a global deal. And they were right, intellectually. And developed countries would say to developing countries, well, everything's changed now, and most emissions come from China and India and South Africa and Brazil. We need to do this together. And those two camps were kind of fighting it out in, as you say, this incredibly complicated procedural language that made it sound impenetrable, a bit like the finance sector where you used to work, right? So it feels like nobody has any idea what's going on. But that was the sort of the irreducible core of what was happening in the center of it. So in the lead up to Paris, this actually wasn't in Paris, it was some months before, we would have various different negotiations where we'd try and hash out this issue. And these were tense, difficult, late nights, aggressive negotiations. And I was sitting there and I found this process incredibly boring. And in the middle of one of these conversations, I was handed this note by Christiana. And given that she was the executive secretary and I was running her political strategy, I thought this would be a note that would talk about what needed to happen to get us through these blockages. And it looked at it and it said, painful, but let's approach with love. And what it did for me was it kind of brought in that broader perspective that happens inside these human relationships, inside these negotiations. You can't control the outcome, but what you can do is you control how you show up in that situation. And if you can show up with as much love, courage, determination, we call it stubborn optimism, a kind of stubborn, gritty and determined optimism. One thing I bring from the monastery, from my time at the UN, from Christiana's brilliant example, because she's a master at this, is you can change the outcome by who you are in the system. And that's something which I think is largely misunderstood in our attempts to try and change the world. And we can sometimes compromise who we are and how we're prepared to engage and end up sort of as bad as the thing we're trying to change. History suggests that, right? When power structures fall, the new power structure tends to take on the oppressive nature of the previous one. It's really interesting. However, it doesn't have to be like that. You can look at these situations and try and approach it with a different quality of mind. And I credit that with the creation of the Paris Agreement.
It reminds me the word love, which I think sometimes gets misinterpreted, but I remember from a Buddhist perspective, somebody had said love is another way of interpreting love is may you be happy. So when you say I love you, it's sort of we in the West we tend to sort of put a kind of lustful kind of thing around it, or in some ways, but or physical thing, but actually it's may you be happy. How can I make you happy? What is it that I need to do? And
also I think importantly there, how do I get beyond my own projection of what is required in order to get to the outcome that I want, right? How do I stop my ego getting in the way of the outcome that I'm trying to create?
So taking that perspective of understanding where the other is coming from, understanding what the perspective of the other is, and trying to therefore act in a way that is understanding of that other position. So we heard Greta Thunberg stand up, and sort of in a speech just recently, and I think it was referred to as the blah 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 speech, and sort of saying that that we're all talking about net zero. We're all talking about, zero carbon, carbon neutral, blah, 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 blah. And her interpretation was that actually nothing is happening. Now, I was just, I think things are happening, but I just don't think things are being communicated very well about what's happening. And I know that you and the guys at Global Optimism, you've possibly got quite a kind of a large, a top-down view of some of the important things that are being done. And I was just wondering if there were, one or two changes that you've seen occur from either the business world or politically over the last sort of year or two. That I know we've been through the COVID pandemic, but are there any positive stories that you can share about big change or fundamental changes that are sort of coming down the line from various organizations or political or countries?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and to me there is an enormous amount, right? And we should sort of get into that. I think just a broader point based on your question is we're going to have to figure out, in a world in which the climate is now changing fundamentally, and we're seeing terrible impacts already at 1.1 degrees, we're going to have to figure out how we stay calm enough in this transition to still make the changes we need to make when there is so much reason for anger all around. And anger isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, Greta's speech, it's all blah, blah, blah. That is like, there's like a seed of rage in there, right? She's like, that is my future, and it's my friends and my family's future, and you've taken it away, and you're destroying the world, and how dare you? That was her last speech, right, in New York, was how dare you? And it's entirely understandable, that form of anger. And I think we're just beginning to see the opening up of that rage. Now, the question is, what happens when that rage goes into the world? And how does that actually translate into the quite complicated systemic change that we need to happen? And I'm sure if she was listening to this, someone like Greta would say, well, it's not complicated, it's simple. We just need to, it's black or white. We either do it or we don't. And that's her power, that she sees it in that way. And my curse is that I see the detail, right, in terms of what does that mean in terms of how it gets navigated? How do you keep people on board? I mean, one thing I will say is Paris was a very different political moment. So Paris was about, and Christiana again was a master at this, she said her narrative was, it's like a highway and we're all going down it at different speeds. And some can go fast to decarbonisation, some can't quite go as fast due to internal things, whatever. Don't worry about them. If a car gets pulled over on the side of the highway because it can't make progress, they've got their lights flashing, they're in trouble. Just keep going, doing what you do. And that broad perspective, everybody's welcome, worked its way into a wave of momentum that ultimately crashed over us and delivered the outcome that we wanted. Now we're in a much more complicated world. We're in a world where some are saying we're making progress, some are saying it's all complete nonsense, we're not making any progress at all, and some are trying to walk the middle ground between them. And within that, it's become quite divisive to the point where when Extinction Rebellion wanted to occupy somewhere in London, they occupied the offices of WWF, right? Not an oil company, because they didn't agree with their approach to the solution. So that can lead to quite a bit of internal strife within those who care about this. It's understandable, but we're going to have to figure out how we deal with that complexity. Now, to me, looking around, there's two answers to your actual question. One is genuine success is still possible in this transition, and genuine failure is possible too. And who are we at this moment of absolute consequence to decide that it's all too hard? Actually, Christiana and I talk about this concept of stubborn optimism. That's a choice. That doesn't mean that we wake up every morning and we say, everything's going to be perfect, it's all going to be fine. It's to say, my God, we live at the fulcrum of this transition to a different world. And future generations will look back and say, well, they just threw their hands up and said, well, it's all a bit too difficult. No, we have to show up with determination and courage and do everything we can. And that's a choice. And it gives us energy to move forward. That's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is also, that's not an irrational choice. I mean, one thing that's different now compared to where we were in 2015 is the solutions are now cheaper than the incumbent energy sources. We said to countries that was coming in 2015, but it wasn't really true. Now, wind and solar are cheaper, not only than new coal and gas in most countries, they're increasingly cheaper than running the already amortized power stations that already exist, right? That's huge, and that completely changes things as that feeds through into the system. The end of the internal combustion engine. We're on the cusp of the end of the internal combustion engine. A complete rethinking of our relationship with the natural world, the 30 by 30 campaign to protect 30% of land and sea by 2030. That now has enormous momentum. $5 billion, the largest ever donation to conservation, was announced at UNGA last week. There'll be more coming up at COP. Already, when we came out of Paris, 2 degrees was felt to be more ambitious. Now everybody's talking about the fact that we need to get to 1.5. More than 50% of the global economy is now covered by a net zero goal by 2050 or sooner. There's a lot, right? The innovation and the entrepreneurship. I mean, even just anecdotally, a whole bunch of people probably that you used to know when you worked in investment banking, previously they were all talking about, subprime mortgages and investing in bonds or whatever else. Now they all want to solve climate change. It's actually really interesting how the cultural zeitgeist and the finance is moving at the same time. I feel really hopeful about this. But like everything in climate change, it's remarkable, unprecedented, and nowhere near enough.
It is interesting. I mean, going back to finance, which was my dark past, that nobody knows about until now. Thanks for telling everyone.
He's outed. He used to work at Deutsche Bank.
It is interesting, that move to climate, looking at the climate. And actually, finance is one of those major areas to help this happen. We're not going to finance oil or coal or whatever it might be. I really love your sort of take on it. And I really love that stubborn optimism approach, which I think is absolutely critical. And I just want to bring back that image of the highway because to me, I've never heard you sort of talk about that before necessarily, but I really love that as an image, and for us to sort of just keep that image in our mind that we're all moving forward, we're all moving at different paces. And actually it's okay for somebody to go slower than us and not to get angry about them if they're pulling over and they're sort of stopping for the moment and taking a breather.
Don't pay any attention to them. It doesn't got nothing to do with you. I mean, if you see a car pulled over on the highway, they're in trouble, right? It's not that you need to stop driving because they're pulled over.
Yeah. I really like that as a kind of an analogy. And I think going back to that Buddhist thing that we started with at the moment, really thinking about that kind of chink of light and stopping our reactivity to certain things, trying to think about what's the right thing to do here and thinking about it with that kind of element of love, kind of trying to sort of support that. So I think those are really sort of lovely images for us to sort of maybe take away. So we're now moving into COP. You're probably going to be suffused with COP meetings and things like this over the coming weeks. Should we worry about COP? Everywhere, when I listen to the radio or the TV, we're all sort of COP this, COP that. But what is it that we should expect to come out of this, if anything at all? Or is it just one part of that highway journey? It's the service station where we all stop and have a chat, but we keep moving down the highway, we refill, whatever. Is there anything that we should be expecting to come out of this?
So it's a good question, and I think it's natural that the media sort of like, when we have all this anxiety about climate, we sort of think about these key moments of, last chance to save the planet, etc. And I think that is understandable, and to a certain degree, elements of that are true, right? But I would say this. In the best of all worlds, the papers the day after COP say 1.5 is still alive, right? It can't guarantee 1.5 because it's only about commitments. But what it could do is demonstrate that actually it's looking unlikely that we're going to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees. So just a little bit of context there. The Paris Agreement was difficult because 194 countries all had to agree unanimously to the same gaveling moment where we have 40 pages of text with a whole bunch of detail in it. This is what we're going to do. This is the objectives. This is how we're going to govern it, etc. It's very difficult to do that. And within the Paris Agreement was a stipulation that we will all reach net zero before the middle of the century. And each of us will come every 5 years with our own next 5-year commitment to get us to that endpoint, right? A bit like saying, I'm going to lose 2 stone in the next year, and my first monthly goal is £1, right? And if you were to look at adding up the first round of what's called nationally determined contributions, the first 5-year commitment, they did not take us on a trajectory to where the end goal was, right? So the end goal was under 2 degrees, best efforts to 1.5, but they were taking us to nearly 3 degrees. So at core, what needs to happen in Glasgow is countries need to come back to the table with their next 5-year goals and begin to bring that trajectory down towards where we ultimately want to get to. Now, it might not. The reason we designed it like that was because it's very difficult to have a policy that changes the economy over decades based on a policy at one time, as we saw with previous attempts. So we thought, well, let's do it this way. First 5-year commitment, long-term goal. And in 5 years' time, the technology will improve, people will understand the impacts more, the politics will change, and we'll be able to ratchet it down, and eventually those two things will come together. So in Glasgow, that temperature trajectory has to be brought down from nearly 3 degrees, ideally to 2 degrees. Now, that's not getting us all the way to 1.5, but it's a big slice that gets taken out. And then in the next ratchet mechanism in 5 years' time, we can bring it further down to under 2 degrees. I think that's going to be hard, if I'm honest. The main reason for that is that a big part of this is to do with China. China says it's going to peak its emissions in 2030, while China, and they haven't given us any detail as to how much they'll increase between now and then. While if they were to increase on the current trajectory, it's really difficult for the rest of the world to fill that gap. And we still don't know if President Xi will even come to Glasgow. So it's going to be hard to do that. But I think what will happen in the end is we'll get a reasonable clutch of nationally determined contributions. We'll get a commitment that countries will come back with another round of commitments in a year or two. We'll get a whole bunch of non-state actor commitments from business, from cities, from investors. And we'll get a moment of clarity on the finance around how we're supporting developing countries. And the question is, will that be enough? And here's the weird thing about these negotiations. The outcome is inherently ambiguous, right? The outcome is not clear in terms of what it leads to. And how it's interpreted is based on how people respond to it. And this is not widely known, but one of the things we did in Paris was every day during the negotiations, we got some of the most important people who were in the negotiations together, and we talked to them and we explained what was going to happen and why it was actually in their interests, not to greenwash what was coming out of it, but to point that we were still moving in a direction. And the reason for that is that COPs don't set policy. How people feel the COP went will determine who invests, what people think about the future of electric vehicles and renewable energy. And at best, the COP will just not stop the transformation that's already underway. So I do worry that due to the split at the moment between the activist groups and what's actually going to happen at COP, that whatever comes out of it, activists will say, it's a failure, it's bullshit, it doesn't matter. And that will make a really big difference to how we all feel about it. And so it could become self-reinforcing unless we actually have a moment where we say, you know what, this was hard and we made a whole bunch of progress, even if it's not enough yet.
So if there's something I'm trying to take out of that, it's that if there's a message to, those two sides, right? The activists and government, let's say, the two players is we need to find a middle ground, a middle way, and we need to be supportive of each other's requirements. So,
yes.
Activists are there because they really, really do want to see net zero.
And they're really worried and angry. Yeah.
And they're worried and angry. And at the same time, government is bound by certain shackles and, and they can't necessarily, they're never made to act quickly, governments, right?
Right.
So they'll never act as quickly as the activists are sort of looking for. So it's to have that discussion. So at Glasgow, they're going to be talking about the 25 to 30 period. And this is where we need to then try and get this down as close to 2 or 1.5, but it probably won't be 1.5. And if we're lucky, it'll be 2. And it's about how do we, as people, organizations, governments, respond to that. And I think what we're hearing is we need to understand the complexity, understand how difficult this process is, and actually believe, we're all on this highway and this journey, and we need to have that stubborn optimism to say, right, okay, even if it's not 1.5 degrees and it's 2.3 or wherever all of those come in at, let's keep going, let's keep supporting, let's keep pushing and keep working together and trying to listen to both sides of the, to all these different arguments. Because I think I always thought listening's the one thing that actually, as a society, we probably are very bad at.
I think that's exactly right. And I don't want to misspeak. I'm not saying anyone should say it's good enough if it isn't, right? But I think that there's a tonal outcome from that. To say what comes out of Glasgow will be the result of a remarkable diplomatic effort to get the world to move further forward at a difficult moment. And it will move us forward by a big chunk. And that big chunk won't be enough. And what I hope is that, and history suggests this isn't always the case, is that our response in the media and as a community of people who care about this can encompass sufficient nuance to reflect both of those things, right? If we say, oh, it's great, Glasgow was good, we've solved it, that's nonsense. If we say, oh, Glasgow was terrible, we've been betrayed, that's also nonsense, right? There's a nuance in between to say Glasgow was a necessary, this is based on how I think the outcome is going to be, Glasgow will be a necessary and important and really quite remarkable step forward, and still not enough. So we still need to keep the pressure on to say we need to do more, we need to go further, we need to continue to transform the economy. But Glasgow needs to be a step in the journey. As Paris was, it can't solve the problem. No moment. We've left it so late now that no moment can solve this problem.
From what I'm hearing, it's all about we all need to be making those steps forward, whatever pace we're doing it at, and not to judge others, but to sort of try and support wherever we can. And I know at Argand we're kind of at the coalface of trying to help customers install renewables, install solar, understand what's going on, model what's going on, and there are challenges, but there also are a whole heap of solutions. So every challenge that's come up so far in terms of how do we put more and more renewables into the grid, how do we kind of suffuse the grid with these kind of this intermittent generation, when people are sort of saying it's not possible, not we as Argand, but we as a sort of the kind of system of electricity generators and network operators and whatever are coming up with solutions. So I'm seeing what's going on with clients and the investments. I'm really positive about what's going on. Or what I think is that we do need to get some sort of financial sticks or indicate, or something to it, like a carbon price that actually kind of comes through and sort of impacts us all. Because at the moment, there's nothing really influencing my decisions
except the price of gas.
Well, this is it. I mean, what's really interesting, and I know we're coming to the end of the podcast, but how actually the last couple of weeks have been remarkable in showing how we as people respond to price. I mean, it's kind of inbuilt into our DNA now, after X number of decades of sort of capitalism and sort of exposure to pricing, where we are, you can see how we're responding to gas prices, how we respond to diesel shortages, which you could align with kind of carbon reductions or sort of supply constrictions. So I think the last couple of weeks have been, actually, I know it's been really difficult for people. There's actually a positive spin on all of this, which is actually how we can respond positively in terms of reducing stuff to price, and how we can bring that into things. But that's a much bigger discussion that's for another time.
And can I also just say, as a podcast host myself, that was a masterful pivot from the world of COP to intermittent grid provision and how we load more renewables on. I mean, I love it. I'm learning a great deal. Nicely done.
I'm learning from you, not from me. Listen, Tom, it's been amazing. I didn't say it at the start, but Tom, Christiana and Paul Dickinson, Christiana Figueres and Paul Dickinson, they have an amazing podcast. It's called Global Optimism. You have to listen to it. I think
it's actually called Outrage and Optimism, which shows that Fraser doesn't listen to it, but you should.
Yeah, it's called something, and there's 3 people on it, and they do a brilliant job of bringing the sort of really interesting and sort of minds in climate and the environment and finance to a table to sort of talk about all of the interesting things. And please listen to it. Outrage and Optimism.
You got it, yeah.
Listen, Tom, it's been amazing to have the opportunity to just talk about this. And thank you for your time. And it's been great.
It's been a pleasure, and very happy to come back any time and maybe talk about what happened after COP.
Right, well, that'll be next week and the week after and the week after that. Thanks, Tom. Been brilliant.
Nice one. Cheers, mate. Bye.
Bye.
This is a How production. Please follow this podcast and share.